This is a case study on audience and impact, and on presenting narrative and character through the lens of nostalgia, and how I intend to put this into practice. To support my case study, I will be looking at Singing in the Rain, Guardians of the Galaxy, Ghostbusters, Spider-Man No Way Home, Licorice Pizza, and Babylon. Since the very early days of cinema, nostalgia has been a key storytelling tool writers and directors use to convey their own thoughts and feelings on particular time periods and historical events that they choose to present. The earliest recollection of a piece of cinematic nostalgia that I can remember was the core narrative of Singing in the Rain, in where the characters are adjusting to the seismic shift in cinema from the silent era to the talkies. This is a perfect example of somebody utilising what they remember from that time period and utilising their nostalgia to create an effective narrative of moving parts. But it's one that ultimately comes back to a memory from the director's past, as back in the 1920s, everyone in the industry was attempting to adjust to such a difficult period. Directors Gene Kelly and Stanley Donen portray this through a spoof or a parody almost, but it feels real and authentic to them and their perspective on what was going on in that period, which in turn utilises their nostalgia excellently. Singing in the Rain went on to be the catalyst for nostalgic cinema, and is now one of the most iconic films of all time. In this current landscape of cinema, however, only a select few filmmakers who are often auteurs utilise nostalgia correctly in this way, but more often than this, big studio heads and blockbuster filmmakers use this as a way to monopolise cinema by using every and all IPs to formulate stories and universes. Nostalgia in cinema nowadays tends to range from something near and dear to a director or writer's heart, or alternatively, a bunch of advertisements for pre-existing intellectual property that is ultimately passed up as nostalgia. Pinpointing the good side of nostalgia for me is looking at Guardians of the Galaxy. The way in which James Gunn methodically writes out the character of Star-Lord to be this outcast who had a good chunk of his childhood taken away from him is outstanding, because the nostalgia that he holds onto in the long run are the only things he remembers from living on Earth, such as the abundance of tracks that he plays from his Walkman from the 70s, and stars from that era of nostalgia, such as Kevin Bacon. For me, it makes for a very interesting character study of someone trying to adjust back to new surroundings and new time frames, all while holding on to those small things that bring him back to reality and back home metaphorically, the key components of what keeps him human to an extent. As Peter Quill was an Earthling before he was abducted by an alien species at a very young age, it makes sense for him to want to hold on to those things that make him feel human. So when James Gunn portrays the character in such a light, we as an audience feel a great amount of impact from just this one use of nostalgia that eventually goes on a long way forward in the expanded universe that the character lives within. This use of nostalgia is not an overbearing one and does not leave a sour taste in the mouth. It in fact enhances the character, which in turn fuels the narrative and the quest he finds himself on, especially in Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2, in where Peter finds more about the truth to his upbringing, and why he's so absorbed in keeping hold of these memories that evoke that nostalgic response. This all links back to my story in the way that what we're seeing on the screen are the memories recollected from my main character, so by having the nostalgia be hers, it will hopefully evoke that kind of response within the audience. Unfortunately, nostalgia is also used to cruelly sap audiences' money from their wallets by giving them brief commercial break moments of happiness by using character, brands, and music from their youth for no other reason than to give the audience a reason to want to watch the film a second time, or even a third or fourth time, and we as cinema goers are all often victims of this. An example of this is Ghostbusters, which was marketed as an all-female team-up film which eventually dissolved into chaos of one-dimensional characters and an aggravating waste of time. The nauseating reminder that this is a Ghostbusters film and that there was a Ghostbusters film that came out in 1984 is so off-putting, with cameos aplenty, and the overabundance of commercialism product placement is nonsensical and overdone to gross extent. This is a great example of how not to do nostalgia, because ultimately as a film with a narrative there is absolutely no payoff, and you're left wondering why you sat through it in the first place, because nothing ended up being tied together, as the film lost all of its sense of perspective when it devolved into becoming one big elaborate SNL sketch with no emotional stakes or payoff. Spider-Man No Way Home falls victim to this too, by using the characters from the Sam Raimi and Mark Webb iterations. But the comparison of that with Ghostbusters is that there's legitimate payoff and high stakes emotionally, and there's genuine reason for these alternate IPs to be present in the narrative.
She told me that with great power comes great responsibility. Wait, what? How do you know that? Uncle Ben said it the day he died.
And ultimately, it makes for a satisfying conclusion. It may be eye-rolling to some,
Maybe she didn't die for nothing, Peter.
but special and emotional to others. Looking at two examples, both Licorice Pizza and Babylon have personal nostalgia at the forefront to their pictures. Licorice Pizza follows the story of an older woman who forms a close bond and friendship with a younger counterpart. According to Paul Thomas Anderson, he had a major crush on one of his art teachers back in his school days, and it's set in the 70s in the San Fernando Valley, and the actress who plays the older woman, Alana Hyam, is actually the daughter of the art teacher he once had a crush on. So the time period, location, and narrative are all relative to his nostalgia of that point in time in his life, which is something that means a lot to him personally, hence why he put it to screen and in the manner that he did it in. The narrative wasn't written to show an underage relationship, it was to showcase the relationship of time and trying to stay young, a major element of nostalgia for a lot of people, and especially PTA during that time. Stories like this, that come directly from the heart and from a place of remembering, are the ones that some directors and writers deem to be their most truthful and their best work. Using this as an example for my film worked because our editor Annie based the initial storyline we went off about her grandmother back in the 60s and 70s, only we use a slightly different era, so in turn, this is her nostalgia we're turning into film form. Babylon follows the three interwoven stories of actors and creatives working in Hollywood from the 20s to 30s. It covers the transition that they make from silent cinema to the talkies and the difficulties that they find at that. Damien Chazelle has made it absolutely no secret that he's a fan of old cinema, with his previous entry La La Land being a love letter to the time period of old classic Hollywood, with a mixing in of new Hollywood all the same. And Babylon is absolutely no different. It follows a very similar narrative to Singing in the Rain, with all the specifics of films and moments in time that Chazelle found interesting in researching once he got into cinema. That essentially sums up the narrative of Babylon in a nutshell. With both Licorice Pizza and Babylon, I can tell that both director-writers found great comfort in going back in time and remembering where they were when certain things happened, or when they watched certain things that went on to further their knowledge of their craft and life itself. They use nostalgia as a comfort blanket and as a storytelling tool to tell stories relevant to themselves, and they all come from a place of realism and not fantasy. A gap not bridged properly by more mainstream artists that attempt the same thing in bigger budget tentpole films. Similar to myself and my co-writer Bonnie, this attests to our passion and love for the eras and the films from that time. We carry very similar motivations in that regard making this film, as we find a lot of comfort from films and music from these eras. Our story takes place through the eyes of Hayley in the 1990s as she's reminiscing on the better times before her best friend passes away during the 80s. Although I and my co-writer were not born during this time period, a major influx of popular culture pieces have inspired us to write a film from such a perspective, and having that knowledge and passion for the era will help us to flesh out everything. So me and my co-writer are writing the time period of the 80s and 90s from our own personal nostalgia, from what we know and what we have seen portrayed before now. In regards to perspective, we feel it's very important to have Hayley's nostalgia tell the story, as it's through her eyes and is what she sees. The interesting element of that is that certain things she sees may not be exactly the version of events that happened. The same goes for the other characters in the story. We want to make it interpersonal to them, and through using certain colours, costuming and overall style relative to their nostalgia and youth, it gives clarity on whose perspective the narrative is actually from. I also believe that you can tell a lot about someone through the way they dress, the music they listen to, the films they watch, etc., and nostalgia plays a big part in that. And it will play a major part in establishing the somewhat off-kilter, envious nature of Hayley as a character. Seeing the jump from how she was in the 80s to the 90s should be a shock, as the change in nostalgia will show this. Being reminiscent of something goes hand in hand with nostalgia, so by making the decision to have the nostalgia be Hayley's is one that makes sense. This establishes character, and with setting the story in a different time period to now, the use of nostalgia will hopefully create a better understanding for the audience in a way without making it too overbearing. Finally, in regards to audience and impact, as a group, we want the audience to discover a deeper sense of reconnection back to their childhoods and younger life, something in which the characters themselves experience over the course of the film. In writing such a script, we believe it's a timeless story in where people can easily identify and connect back to those youthful moments in their lives. With setting the film in the 80s, I believe it's an era that I think that everyone is somehow connected to, through parents and relatives alike, from these people showing us films, music and clothing from that era that they grew up on and enjoyed. This would hopefully set off that spark of a memory for those old and young when they sit down to watch our film. It wouldn't be showcased as something in your face, but something rather subtle, in that we won't be relying on IPs and certain music due to right issues, but rather we want it to feel faithful for those who grew up in such an era, and this will all be done through the matter of research and going back to our families to really get a sense of what it was like to be alive in the era of the 80s and the 90s. The eras in time that inspire us so deeply with their rich history and popular culture, which ultimately inspired us to make our film into a reality.